Just think, now not only can you watch Aladdin, you can be Aladdin.
Your second wish is Capcom's command. Disney's Aladdin. Quality entertainment software flying to your Super Nintendo Entertainment System from Capcom.
Get this! At school I found this magic lamp, and I wished for Disney's Aladdin for my Sega Genesis. It's like the movie!
Sega Genesis and Disney's Aladdin game cartridge.
If you were colorblind and had an IQ less than 12, then you wouldn't care which portable you had.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Player One Start. Today we're going to revisit the Aladdin series that was released during the early 90s. So why am I going back to some of my previous videos and redoing them? Am I out of creative ideas? Well, actually no. I was actually going to repost some of these videos on social media because of the upcoming movie coming out. However, after looking through them, I see how dated they've become, and it's only been a year and a half. But in that time, I made several improvements to how I make my videos, from capturing game footage, recording narration, and even shooting in front of my game shelves. So I thought, if we were going to do this, we have to do it right, and I thought I would give an updated version of this that may be more enjoyable for you to watch. And if you'd like, I'll leave links to the original versions that are still posted online if you guys want to go back and watch those after this is done. In my previous videos, I actually reviewed each of the games separately in their own video. First, I looked at the Super Nintendo version and its subsequent Game Boy Advance port. Then I looked at the Sega Genesis version and its Game Boy Color port. And finally, I looked at the Game Gear version, which was also released for the Sega Master System, although I didn't have that version at the time. The movie Aladdin was released on November 25th of 1992, and eventually went on to become the most financially successful movie of that year. After its home video release on VHS on October 1st of 1993, there would be a couple of video games that would come out to cash in on the craze. The first version released would be for the Sega Genesis. This is the version that would be ported across PCs and even back to Nintendo consoles. Shortly after, Capcom would release a version exclusively on the Super Nintendo. And then Sega made another version for the Game Gear through a second-party developer that would also see an appearance on the Master System. Now, having different versions of games for different consoles was nothing new. After all, we were still living through the console wars of the early 1990s. What is strange, though, is that the next movie, The Lion King, would only have one official game ported to both the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo, which posed the question, what's up with Aladdin? So I find the video games based on Aladdin to be kind of a strange case when compared with other Disney properties, especially compared to other Disney games that came after it. For example, when I got The Lion King, I was shocked to find out that it was the same across the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. And it's still incredible to me to find out that there was 3 different games made for this movie, even a couple years after it came out. So another thing I want to do in this video is actually compare all 3 games and see which one was better. That said, let's go ahead and get started with the gameplay. Alright, we're in the first stage, Agrabah. Now in this game you're not really given a weapon except for an apple, and I think this because Nintendo wanted kind of a more child-friendly game. They didn't really see having a game with someone wielding a sword and killing other people with it to be actually child-appropriate. I'm not sure what those vases with legs are. Never saw them in the movie. And at the end of each stage, you're given an arrow to let you know that you're going to move on to the next one. If you collect one of those scarabs throughout the game, you'll be given a bonus game to try to earn some extra points, lives, or any other power-up. However, 9 times out of 10, I end up getting the same power-up every time, which is just another continue, which is what those stars are. At the end of each stage, you are going to confront kind of a little mini-boss here. like how Boo is, he's pretty much useless throughout the whole game here, but he's kind of hilariously useless in this scene. At the end of each stage, you are given a password, so in case you want to turn off the console and come back and continue, you can just enter in this password and go through. The second stage is the Cave of Wonders, and you'll notice in this one I actually earlier picked up the canopy that will allow you to kind of float around, and I really recommend getting this if you're going to beat this game, because eventually when you go through the later levels, you have to have some precise platforming, and it's just a nightmare to do it without that canopy to kind of slow you down a little bit. Eventually in the Cave of Wonders, you'll meet the magic carpet, and you'll be able to continue. And I understand that it takes some creative license with the movie because there wasn't really much in the Cave of Wonders that they showed, so they didn't show like the floating log river, and eventually you get the magic lamp, and just enough time to see Abu try to steal a forbidden treasure. Next you go to what I think is one of the most beautiful stages in the game. There's definitely a lot going on here, and this always made my heart pump and adrenaline go when I was playing this stage as a kid. However, the next part of this level is just a little unfair. They always get that lava wave always coming in, forcing you to one side of the screen. So you'll see me get through this in one run, but that's just because I've memorized it through years of trying to play through this level. You'll probably die many, many times going through this if you've never played it before and memorized where everything's at. And next to go to another very beautiful level here, inside the Genie's Lamp. And this is where that canopy I told you about earlier, there's a lot of precise jumps you have to make, and without that canopy to kind of float you around, it really becomes difficult. Especially when the genie is making things appear right in front of you. Now, I've been ignoring them here, but if you see those red gems, there's actually a special ending that you can unlock by getting all those, but they're really difficult to grab, so I'm just not grabbing them for this playthrough. Now, this next cutscene kind of explains why this next level is in here. I'm showing it because it really stands out from the rest of the game, and I don't remember anything about this in the movie. So, Stage 5. Sure, why not a pyramid? I kind of feel like maybe that Capcom had designed this level for a different game, but then thought, you know, to scrap it, and they saved it until eventually they said, hey, why don't we put it in an Aladdin game? And again, the ending boss in this level is just a little bit hilarious because it's not really a boss at all. Alright, so as I said, the Genie level has a lot of intense platforming jumps, and so does the Pyramid level. And that is why I think they included this level, because there's literally no way to die in this level, and it's just kind of a nice, relaxing level to give you a little break before the final battle. That level is short-lived though, and now you're facing the most difficult stages of the game. One part of the movie I thought was a missed opportunity, and no game takes advantage of this, was nobody made a level about how Aladdin gets back to Agrabah from the North Pole or wherever he gets sent when Jafar launches him off into the far reaches of the earth. But no, we definitely needed a pyramid level, am I right? After going through Jafar's palace, you are eventually meeting up with Jafar himself, and you face off in a battle of lightning and potted plants with legs and wings. All that leads up to a final battle between Aladdin and Snake Jafar. So I do think that this is probably the best of the Aladdin final battles. However, it does suffer from extreme slowdown when Jafar spits out those eggs out of his mouth or whatever they're supposed to be. And just like that, you've beaten the game, and a final cutscene reveals what happens at the end of the movie. When I was a kid, I actually never owned the Super Nintendo version. This was a constant weekend rental for me. Like a lot of Super Nintendo games, there was a port of this game to the Game Boy Advance, and they did make some changes. Some good, some bad. On the surface, this game is actually a very faithful port. The main difference I see here is that the screen size is actually reduced just a little bit to better fit the display of the Game Boy Advance. But other than that, the graphics and sound are faithfully recreated, and the controls are there as well. I am glad to see that the canopy/parachute has made its return, as it does make these platforming jumps just a little bit more tolerable. Through my playthrough, I didn't really notice any sort of extra challenge due to the screen crunch, except for in a couple of areas, but not in the areas that I thought I would. An extra feature to this game is that they actually added a few extra levels. While these levels are a welcome addition, I didn't actually feel like they added too much to the game. Each of the extra levels only takes place in an area that has already been designed for the game, so they don't add any new locations. The consistent gimmick is that each of these levels seems to be built on an angle that is maybe supposed to add a bit more challenge, but I got through fairly easily. The original version for the Super Nintendo actually doesn't use that much music from the movie, instead going for original tracks. And I assume that's why the following change was made. Just listen to the song that's playing in the background. You're supposed to be hearing "You Ain't Never Had a Friend Like Me." But here they decided to do some sort of quirky parody version of it. And again, they replaced A Whole New World with this not as appealing soundtrack. This is unfortunate because this actually made me enjoy this game a lot less than I thought it would. One welcome addition, and I'm assuming this is due to the fact that the Game Boy Advance has a limited battery life, they decided to add a save feature, so you can save at any point and come back to your game later. So overall, I'm not as impressed with the Game Boy Advance port, so because of those changes made to this game, I actually prefer the Super Nintendo version a little bit more. That could be mainly because I played the Super Nintendo version more as a kid, but one thing that just kind of bothers me is that they made changes to the soundtrack, so after years of hearing the same soundtrack over and over again, it's something I just couldn't get used to. But if you are playing this portably instead of on a TV, then I actually would recommend this as an option for you even still to this day. So years later, in 1994, I actually got a Sega Genesis, and one of the games I couldn't wait to get for it was, you guessed it, Aladdin. Let's go ahead and take a look at this game. Again, we're going to use the Game Genie because we are still playing Aladdin, and it makes quite a stack to see everything all piled up on top of there, especially with the 32X on top of the Genesis, with the Game Genie on top, and Aladdin on top. I forgot about that. Alright, so I'm going to again skip past the cutscenes. One thing that's nice about the Genesis version is that you're given these intro screens. Alright, getting used to the controls, you have two attacks, you have apples, and you have your sword. Immediately, the first difference I noticed is that there is no sword in the Super Nintendo version. I assume that was to make the game a little bit more friendly for kids. One thing I want to note right away is I noticed how smooth all the animations seem. It really looks like that the programmers of this game paid a lot of attention to detail to the Disney style of animation to make everything appear very fluid on screen. I really like the ability to deflect swords back at your target. And something that's different from the Super Nintendo version is that you actually get these genie save vases, so it acts like a checkpoint, and you're able to meet the merchant who can sell you extra lives and other things. And at the end of each stage, you're given a little cutscene. Now, the Genie bonus game in this one's a little bit different, but still very difficult to get something useful. And if you collect the Abu head hanging around in each level, you'll get a bonus level. And in this level, your goal is to avoid getting hit by the falling pots while collecting gems. And as you can tell, I didn't get very far, but I did get somewhat farther than I usually do. Alright, next we're going to get a desert level, and this is unique to the Genesis version. And in this level, your goal is to find the two halves to the scarab. You can kind of see one off to the side there. There's the first half. There's the second half. The restrooms always look kind of amusing, and they got one for the genie. That's probably one more thing I can say that they added to this game, is they added a lot more humor. And here's the third half of the scarab. And in this level, it's almost the same exact thing as the last one. You just have to find these items to keep going. So this game is kind of like a collectathon as compared to the Super Nintendo version. Once you find the flute, then you're able to use the pot to escalate you to the next part of the level. I gotta say, I really like the music in this level. However, I really don't care for the enemies in this level. There are two of them that are just awful. The bat, which is very hard to see, and these skeletons that hold bombs for their head. I don't know why. They explode, their bones go everywhere, and it's almost impossible to avoid. Now, there was a level like this in the Super Nintendo version, but in this level, your goal is to destroy these statues so you can keep moving forward. At this point, the level of platforming has become very difficult. I have no idea what that guy is supposed to be. And here you get a little death animation, which is kind of funny. After you get through the Cave of Wonders, then you have to escape. And just like the Super Nintendo version, you have to proceed on foot at first. You are eventually given access to the magic carpet, and you have to fly your way through a lava wave. One thing I do like about this that's not in the Super Nintendo version is that it does give you a slight warning before each obstacle comes. Makes it a little bit easier, but overall I find this about the same difficulty as the Super Nintendo version. Again, we're given the opportunity to proceed inside the genie's lamp. Now I have to say, this level is very creatively designed. However, its visual appeal I don't think lives up to the Super Nintendo version as much. I think the Super Nintendo version looks a little bit better. This one seems a little dark. However, getting through the lamp is actually a little bit more fun. You have to kind of figure out how to go through each section. But once you get all the way through the genie's lamp, you are now at the Sultan's Palace. Now this is different from the Super Nintendo version because you are now at the palace before Jafar is taken over. So I don't know why the guards are attacking you at this point. I honestly don't understand why this level's in here. But eventually you meet up with Iago and you have to battle him for a little while, and then you reach the final level, where you have to make your way through the most difficult stage of the game until you meet up with Jafar. Once you defeat Jafar, you're given this ending. So the Sega Genesis version was actually ported to a variety of other systems, including PCs. However, one thing I find kind of strange is that it was also ported to the Game Boy Color. This version of the game was ported to a whole bunch of other systems, but what's really strange is it actually made it to a Nintendo console on the Game Boy Color. So I guess this was during a time where Nintendo thought it was okay to have a sword-wielding maniac on their console. But other than the severe graphics downgrade, this game is designed exactly the same way as the Genesis version. Even the music has been largely untouched, as they have created 8-bit versions of the 16-bit score from the Genesis. My biggest complaint about this game is that the visual flair from the Genesis and the animation style is completely gone. The gameplay is slow and choppy and is not really my favorite version of the game, not even my favorite portable version of the game. But for the time, I would have been very impressed by this port, and I think I probably would have bought it had I owned a Game Boy Color at that time. My opinion as of the making of this review is that this game just hasn't aged well. So again, comparing the Game Boy Color version to the Genesis version, I still prefer the Genesis version, and I think the choice here is a bit more obvious. The Sega Genesis version has better graphics, better animations, I think better controls, and just overall provides a better gaming experience. Even if you had this game portably on a Game Boy Color, I don't think I would have liked it as much. Alright, let's go ahead and move on to the Game Gear version. The Game Gear version is actually the most obscure out of all three versions of Aladdin. While doing research for this game, the only thing I could find on it was that Sega had the license to make a portable version of Aladdin and decided to use it before their license with Disney ran out. So they contracted someone to quick put together a game for something they could launch on the Game Gear. Now my Game Gear still works, but it has a couple of quirks. The first being that it will not put audio out through the speaker in the Game Gear anymore, it only works through the headphone jack. The second is that I have to hold the screen at a little bit of an angle to be able to clearly see what's on the screen. And lastly, as you can see from me trying to record this with a camera, I can't really get a good clear image to record on here, so I decided to go ahead and use an emulator to video capture this so that you can see and hear the game clearly. Keep in mind, since my emulator is actually upscaling this to 1080p, you are seeing this more clearly than was ever intended. The first thing about Aladdin on the Game Gear that you may notice is that the cutscenes on the Game Gear are actually very interactive, more so than on the Genesis or the Super Nintendo, where they usually just show you a static, flat image. Here, they're actually animated really well. It's kind of amazing that the least capable hardware has the best cutscenes. First, you may notice, instead of a save system, they use a password system in case your batteries die, which often did in the Game Gear, so you can come back and play it later. So this game actually starts off exactly like the movie. The first scene that you see Aladdin in is the one in which he steals a loaf of bread and is being chased by the guards. So in this level, your goal is just to survive until you flee from the guards. The only problem I have with this level is that with the screen crunch being so small on this, you can't really see too far ahead of you to actually know when the objects are coming. So it's just a simple memorization game to figure out how you need to get through the level. This seems to remind me of a game like, I don't know, like Temple Run or Mirror's Edge, something like that. Again, the developers in this game really do a good job of duplicating the scenes in the movie for the cutscenes in the game, except for this part. I don't remember a part where Aladdin unleashes a boo on a guard and he gouges his eyes out. Seriously, look, he gouges his eyes out. And the second level is much like the first. You just have to run through the rooftops, avoiding the obstacles until you flee from the guards. If I had to pick a game that followed the plot of the movie the closest, I would have to say it's definitely this version. So far, almost every scene from the movie has been verbatimly copied in this game. So the Cave of Wonders is actually the first level in the game where you get free reign on where you take your character. And I have to say that this is a welcome change to the level design, because I was afraid that all the levels are just going to be me being chased through some sort of area. I would say the only time I found the gameplay frustrating was when I had to learn some button combinations, because there's only 3 buttons, the start, the 1, and the 2 button on the Game Gear. So to do some of the moves, you actually have to press 2 buttons at a time. Other than that, I feel that each of these levels look very pleasant. It definitely takes advantage of the color palette of the Game Gear, and the music matches well with each level. One thing that's nice in the game is that when you die, you immediately get a chance to continue. So now, similar to the Super Nintendo version, we are now in the treasure room. Your goal is just to avoid touching anything in here, and then you can make it to the end of the level. The next level should look familiar, as all 3 games have featured a lava tunnel where you ride the magic carpet through, while avoiding falling rocks and other obstacles. After finding the genie, you make your way back to the Sultan's palace, where again you have to sneak your way past the guards. In the next level, you see this game has a much different interpretation of the magic carpet ride than the Super Nintendo version, where you have to avoid smacking into birds and getting hit by lightning. You also have to avoid some of these jumping, galloping horses, which I find hilarious that they can jump that high. It was at this point when I noticed how many automatically scrolling levels this game has. And that also includes one more final scrolling level where you battle Jafar. After that, you're off to an incredibly easy battle with Jafar, followed by a battle with Snake Jafar. Then, almost as quickly as the game began, the game ends. When I initially did this video, I didn't yet own a Sega Master System copy of this game. And now that I do, I have to tell you, I much prefer playing it on the Sega Master System, mainly because it opens up the screen border and pulls back your view. So those hazards that you couldn't see until it was too late, now you have more time to react to. And I think that fixes a lot of the problems I had with the Game Gear version. So out of those 2 versions, I would prefer the Sega Master System version. Alright, so you may not have known this, but we've actually played through 6 different Aladdin games. These are all of the official ports that I know of, but there's also a couple of games that aren't really related to the original movie. There was a PlayStation game that was released that I currently don't own. Maybe in a future video I'll go back and review that, but so far we've played all of them. So which version of Aladdin is better? At number 3, I would actually rank the Sega Master System version. First, let's look at all 3 games compared at the same time. I think my least favorite here would probably be the Game Gear. I say that because it's kind of like a side-scrolling version of Temple Run, where all you do is run and avoid enemies. In fact, its second stage is the exact same. Moving on to the Cave of Wonders, again, I actually don't like the Game Gear version as much, as Aladdin kind of moves a little clunky in this stage. In terms of the lava carpet stages, they all seem to have their strengths and weaknesses. And in fact, this is one on the Game Gear I actually don't mind as much. I would say it's kind of a draw at this point. Both the Genesis and the Super Nintendo have a stage devoted to the Genie's Lamp. Unfortunately, the Game Gear version skips this entirely, only giving us a cutscene. And looking at the Jafar battle on the Game Gear versus the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, it's a bit ridiculous and incredibly easy. And all 3 games end with Aladdin and Jasmine on the magic carpet flying off into the night. And when you look at all three games compared, the Sega Game Gear has the least amount of levels, and most of those were automatically side-scrolling levels that I didn't really care for very much. I think the Master System version is done very well. It fixes a lot of the mistakes with the Game Gear version, and makes the game a lot more enjoyable. I would consider this title a must-have if you own a Sega Master System. But coming down to the Genesis or the Super Nintendo version, which one do I think is better? Well, I'm going to go with the Super Nintendo version. And it could be like splitting hairs, but there was a couple of things I liked about the Super Nintendo version that was better than the Genesis. First off, all of the sound. Many of you who have seen my video reviews before, when I talk about the Sega Genesis sound chip, I point out some of my distaste for it. But before you start spouting off about how, oh, there's great Genesis music, I think there is. I just don't think there's a lot of it in this game. If I put in a version of Vector Man or Sonic the Hedgehog, those have great soundtracks, and they utilize this sound chip very well. However, a lot of games that were made as ports or had a cheaper development budget or, a quick turnaround time, they didn't give the developers a lot of time to properly utilize the sound chip, so they end up using a lot of the default sounds, and it sounds very bland, generic, and sometimes just bad. In this game, I didn't really find there was a track that was unbearable to listen to. I just didn't like it when compared to the Super Nintendo version. In fact, let's go ahead and make a direct comparison so you can hear for yourself. So that is actually a night and day difference for me. One other thing that I didn't mention in my previous reviews is that by default, the Sega Genesis puts out a mono soundtrack. In other words, both speakers, if it's stereo, play the same sound. On the Super Nintendo version, it's stereo sound, and it's all samples. Combine that with Capcom's flair for providing catchy tunes and making beautiful sounding music on Nintendo consoles, and I think you have a sure winner just from that alone. The only downside to the Super Nintendo version I wish they had that the Genesis version had were the smooth animations. I think Aladdin looks better on the Sega Genesis console. I mean, they followed that art style to a T. And Capcom's version of Aladdin on the Super Nintendo looks good, but it doesn't look as accurate. Both games had to take creative license to create enemies and bosses. In the Super Nintendo, I think the most ridiculous boss that's spread all throughout the game are those pots with legs and wings. Somebody has said, oh, they're hawks stuck in a pot. I don't know what their official designation is. They just look weird, and they are everywhere. Enemies in the Sega Genesis version also has some creative license taken with them, like those stone statues you have to take care of. Oh, and there's that boss character that floats around the screen wielding a sword by its tail and floating around. I don't know what that guy is. I never remember seeing that in the movie. But the Sega Genesis version sometimes feels more like a collectathon because you have to collect certain items to be able to progress through the stage. So even though it has a weapon you can use instead of jumping on enemies, I think there's less of a focus on defeating enemies and more on completing the stage. But anyway guys, that's just my opinion. What do you guys think of these games? Do you agree with my opinions of the show or not? Let me know what you guys thought about these games down in the comments below. I'd really like to see your guys' take on them. That said guys, that's about going to wrap it up for this video. Remember, if you like what you see, please hit that like and subscribe button, share with a friend. As always, you can reach out to me on various social media. Again, I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and stay tuned because I have more content coming. I'll see you guys next time. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Also, if you enjoy the content of this channel, please remember to click on this subscribe button. Again, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. If you'd like to see some of the content I've already done, feel free to click on some of the suggestions that are popping up on your screen. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.